Hello, my name is Marila Mensch. I'm a researcher and assistant to director at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're based in Montreal, and we conduct research on genocide prevention and mass atrocity prevention. And this is my colleague.
Hi, I'm Noah Shuela. I'm a student at the University of Toronto, and I'm a youth research fellow at MIGS this summer.
So today we are going to discuss the current crisis in South Sudan. So we have a great panel today. Why don't you introduce yourselves? Perhaps Akshaya first?
Yeah, sounds good. Hi, my name is Akshaya Kumar. I'm a Sudan and South Sudan policy analyst at the Enough Project, which is an organization based in Washington, D.C., focused on situations of mass atrocity.
It seems like Akshaya has frozen a bit. Perhaps we'll ask Sky to introduce herself, and we'll return to Akshaya.
Sure. My name is Sky Wheeler. I'm a researcher working for Human Rights Watch on South Sudan.
Great, thank you. Why don't you start the introduction?
Sure, I'll do the introduction. So in July 2011, with a 99% pro vote, South Sudan became an independent state. After years of civil war and violence, many believed that the schisms that once divided larger Sudan might dissipate, allowing for the development of good governance and at least a modicum of prosperity. In 2013, however, as divisions emerged in the government structure, the population seemed to be divided on the basis of their loyalty to either the president or the newly fired vice president. And the violence emerged once more. The subsequent conflict between South Sudan's government forces, the SPLA, and the rebel SPLA-In Opposition has seen some of the most atrocious violations of human rights, especially in oil-producing unity state. A recent Human Rights Watch report documented several cases of rape, extra-judicial killing, torture, and countless other war crimes and crimes against humanity. 143,000 students are currently enrolled in UNICEF emergency education programs. 2 million individuals have been displaced by the conflict. 4 million people are living in a state of food insecurity. The humanitarian crisis alone merits the attention of the international community, yet continues to fall on deaf ears. To make sense of the causes, dynamics, and hopefully to get some proposals to end the conflict and devastation we are seeing in South Sudan, we will defer to our most esteemed panel.
So we're going to ask our panelists several questions, and based on their experience, they'll answer if needed.
Great. So the first question I have is about the roots of the conflict. The civil war in South Sudan, many people believe started when President Salva Kiir accused the former Vice President Riek Machar of attempting to create a coup. Yet to what extent can the roots of the conflict be boiled down to solely elite politics? Do ethnic strife between Dinka and Nuer, strategic communal control for resources, or third-party power brokering represent any relevant aspects of the conflict? Sky, would you like to start?
Sure, I can speak to some of that. I mean, the roots of this conflict are very old indeed. Some of the dynamics that we've seen at play over the last 19 months are dynamics that have been around for decades, including relationships between individuals and more broadly between different ethnic groups and different sets of allegiances within South Sudan. But I guess for our purposes, it's also interesting to note that not only the fact that there has been a conflict and that it follows these patterns is of interest, but the nature of the conflict, the extraordinarily high level of abuses against civilians, the raping, burning of villages, women being raped, people being killed, including often because of their ethnicity. This also follows patterns that are very deep in South Sudan that have been going on for many decades. So not only is this conflict not new, the patterns of abuse and the lack of accountability for abuses are also very old patterns.
Thank you. Akshaya?
Yeah, I agree with Sky about that analysis, and particularly the really worrying nature of the incredibly brutal violence that we've seen in South Sudan over the past 19 months. And also the fact that this violence echoes a very similar schism that existed between the liberating ruling party of South Sudan, the SPLM, when it was an armed movement back in the 90s. And so some of those same stories are playing out over and over again. The one addition that we would make from the perspective of the Enough Project, and also from the perspective of our new initiative, The Century, is that there are other dynamics at play as well that are worth examining. They may not be the dynamics that are the causes, but they are certainly the dynamics that are sustaining this violence. And that has to do with external powers' interests in the conflict in South Sudan, whether it's Ugandan President Museveni's interest, because he has troops in South Sudan right now, whether it's the Sudanese government's interest. They have been documented as sending weapons to the armed opposition, but also the broader regional interests of enablers who have particular allegiances to one or the other of the elite factions in South Sudan, and who believe that in some ultimate dispensation, whether it's a transitional government or later on, they could accrue some benefits, whether it's from South Sudan's natural resources or contracts, if they just continue to back their guy or their faction.
Yeah, the international and regional implications and involvement, national interest is certainly something that we'll discuss a bit later on.
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely going to get into that. But just to touch on this, Sky, if you don't mind, you mentioned that there are patterns that go back for a long time that target civilians. Is there any way you can give us an insight on why those patterns started, or why is it that civilians are bearing the brunt, where it seems to be, or it operates under the auspice of a war between two factioning parties? How is it that civilians continue to bear the brunt?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we've documented many hundreds of cases, and we know that there are thousands of cases in which individuals or groups of people have been targeted and killed because of their ethnicity or perceived allegiances, including in some very gruesome massacres that took place in the early days of this conflict. The reasons for this are many. There is a very profound failure in South Sudan to distinguish between civilians and non-civilians, and this runs this failure in this most basic principle of humanitarian law runs the full gamut. So we see civilian property being destroyed, we see villages being attacked, and we see civilians being shot and killed. And I mean, the reasons for this are many. I mean, in South Sudan, you'll often find situations where a town is captured by one force, the opposite force flees ahead of the capture, and then the attacking force enters the town, basically instead of fighting because the others have fled, kill all the civilians that they find out of revenge, out of a sense that these people have been supporting those fighters. I mean, we've seen this not only in this conflict, but also in a smaller conflict that was in 2013 in Jonglei State, where government forces also attacked civilians who were perceived to be aligned with another rebel group. I mean, the reason why it continues is because no one is held to account, and commanders do not try and change this particular tactic, this use of this approach of killing civilians. No one has ever, as far as we've been able to ascertain, been prosecuted for killing civilians unlawfully.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Actually, would you like to add to that at all, or?
I think the one factor that really disturbs me is the extent to which, while civilians bear the brunt of this violence, as Sky described so eloquently, the leaders of this conflict, the people who are privileged enough to be given the authority to speak on behalf of South Sudanese, whether they're on the opposition side or on the government side, those leaders are completely divorced from these realities, in large part because many of them don't even live in South Sudan anymore. They've moved, whether it's because they're part of the opposition and they feel fearful in Juba, or because maybe they themselves stay in a hotel in South Sudan occasionally, but they have their families who live abroad and children who attend boarding schools and the rest. And so for them, there's a kind of disturbing willingness to continue down a path of intransigence in a way because they themselves haven't felt any of the personal pain of these reciprocal, cyclical, violent conflicts, both because there's been no justice and accountability in the courts, but also because they personally have been able to kind of live insulated above the rest of this war and conflict.
Mm-hmm. We work with the Romeo Dallaire's Child Soldiers Initiative, and we've read several times over the past few months and over the past year that several groups in South Sudan and on both sides try to recruit child soldiers. And do you see that as a sign of perhaps the conflict getting even worse? The fact that, you know, child soldiers are perhaps a warning sign of you know, a conflict getting worse or future atrocities being committed?
So the use of child soldiers is a widespread phenomenon in South Sudan, and it predates this conflict. It's always been the case that where there is conflict in South Sudan, boys 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 will join the fight. So I'm not sure if I would necessarily say that it was an indication that things are going to get worse. I mean, obviously it's a very serious abuse in and of itself. Many of the child soldiers who I've spoken to who have fought with the opposition, some with the government, many with allied militias from one or the other. Sometimes they fought with both. It's not necessarily a sign of things getting worse, but it's a very serious abuse in itself. Like, most of these kids report having seen other children killed in the conflict. The total kind of lack of accountability is of concern. There's at least 2 militia leaders who have forcibly recruited large numbers of children. We've not seen, both of those militia leaders have been aligned with the government at one point or another, and we've not seen any action by the government taken against these 2 men, despite well-documented patterns of widespread forced recruitment. And that's obviously of concern. The other thing I would say is that maybe it's interesting is one of the reasons why so many boys join one or another armed group is partly often because this is a warrior culture and they believe that they have a duty to fight, but it's also for their own safety. It's an indication of the extent to which, you know, this kind of failure to distinguish between civilians and combatants, you know, how deep this failure is that if you're 15 years old, your best safety is to join an armed group. I mean, sometimes for food, it's the only way to get food, but often because you are a target. If you are of fighting age, you are a target. So you are safer to be in an armed group than out of one. And I think that speaks volumes to the general, you know, human rights situation that these guys, these kids are growing up in.
Akshay, do you have something to add, perhaps?
I would agree with all that Sky said. The really worrying dimension of this, of course, is that kids are going to war instead of having the chance to learn and study and prepare themselves to really rebuild the nation of South Sudan, which is just 4 years young now. and also that the U.S. government decides every year annually, and President Obama has the opportunity to make this decision once again this year, to give a waiver to South Sudan. And so even though there are laws on the books within the United States which say that the U.S. government will not provide military assistance to any country where there are these types of endemic child soldiering problems, each year for the past years, ever since South Sudan has become an independent country, the U.S. government has decided to waive that, to reserve its opportunity and the option to provide military assistance to South Sudan, and they were doing that for many years. Right now, it's our understanding that those programs are suspended, but the broader normative statement that it makes when President Obama says that it's in the national security interests of the United States to continue to be able to, at some point in time, provide this assistance, even though this child soldiering goes on, is incredibly worrying and disturbing. And it's something that we hope when the President makes his decision this year, he'll really reevaluate, particularly given the real prevalence of child soldiering on both sides of this ongoing conflict.
We were also wondering about perhaps the lack of international attention to the crisis, especially in the media. We read a lot, obviously, about Syria and Iraq and ISIS, a lot about Nigeria and Boko Haram. But in South Sudan, we have a huge humanitarian crisis, a huge refugee crisis. And I know several years back when there was a lot of talk in the US about Sudan and Darfur, and there was a lot of attention back then. But today it seems that, sometimes we see the South Sudan mentioned in the media, in the New York Times, for example, but that's pretty much it. I'm not reading a lot more. So I'd like to have your take on this.
Akshay, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think that you're right. The level of attention that this crisis has garnered has not been really commensurate to the incredible devastation that we're seeing in South Sudan. Part of that is exactly for the reason that you mentioned, which is that unlike at the time when the conflict in Darfur was raging, right now the world is faced with crises around the world at an incredibly large scale, whether it be ISIS or Syria. And so there is some division of attention, but that doesn't mitigate the need for greater attention on South Sudan. And we were happy to see President Obama in his recent trip to Africa, even though he didn't, of course, meet with the leaders or travel to South Sudan itself. While he was in both Kenya and Ethiopia, he made South Sudan a point that he focused on in his discussions with heads of state, and he actually even held a high-level meeting of different regional heads of state to discover what was the real underlying dynamic in why this conflict was forward. It brought the entire White House press corps' attention to this conflict, and we hope that that attention will be sustained through August 17th, when South Sudan's two warring parties are expected to either sign a deal and commit to peace or face consequences that the president himself has termed a Plan B.
But in the media or among the U.S. population, do you see is South Sudan even being spoken about? Because I know here in Canada, it's really something that we barely see in the media. It's all about, obviously Canadian elections, but also a lot about, security, so ISIS and Iraq. And I don't think a lot of people actually know what's really going on. I'm not sure, if Sky, you can perhaps comment on this as well. Either or.
I mean, I don't really. I mean, I think it's really sad that we don't see more about South Sudan. I think it's down to two things. I mean, partly it's that it's a very sad narrative whereby we've got two sides who are engaged in basically a pretty meaningless conflict, and a large number of people are getting hurt, but there's no clear good guy, bad guy in this conflict. And I think that has made it less appealing for the media to cover. I also just think we're just living in a time where we just have less media than we used to. it's, yeah, I mean, it's had a big impact on this conflict and how people understand it.
Although we do have media if you want to cover Cecil the Lion, but then maybe not South Sudan.
Yeah, well, if the intransigence is any is due to any amount of a lack of accountability, you know, failing media attention is certainly not going to bolster that. So my next question is on something that actually I mentioned earlier. It's the regional dynamics. So can you explain the impact of different regional enmities or power struggles at play here? I'm going to ask about IGAD, so maybe we'll ask about whether IGAD has been used as a forum to help balance power, or whether the competition between Uganda and Sudan, or Uganda and Ethiopia, has really helped to either fuel or diffuse the conflict. So maybe we'll start with Akshay, because you had mentioned it earlier.
Yeah. This is something that we have really been focused on and studying at my organization, the Enough Project. It's something that's deeply worrying because, on one hand, South Sudan's neighbors, the region, the IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, who have been leading the past 18 months, basically the entire length of the conflict, they've been trying to lead a mediation between the warring parties. They do have the best chance of influencing these guys, President Kiir and former Vice President Riek Machar, because they know them well. They have something at stake here, so they have an interest, they have a reason to be involved. On the other hand, what we've seen over the past 19 months is that even though they do have the best chance of making a difference, often the real leverage that they need to push the parties to make true concessions hasn't been exerted because of these competing tensions between Ugandan interests and Sudanese interests, and even fears in Kenya and Ethiopia about business interests that might be jeopardized if some of South Sudan's elites and their enablers and backers really felt some repercussions for their actions which choose war over peace.
Yeah.
Sky, would you like to add anything?
No, not really.
Okay.
I think actually described it well.
Perfect. So then my next question, sort of going off that, is now that we have the new empowerment of IGAD Plus that will be incorporating the stewardship of the AU, the UN, the US, the UK, Europe, Norway, and China, will the added, I guess, players is the best way to say it, produce an end to the violence, or at least hopefully get us to a temporary ceasefire? Is there any more of a chance to see that now with the added players? So would anyone like to answer that one first? Or?
I think the idea behind bringing these other players in is that IGAD has taken this agreement, taken this mediation process far enough. They've taken it to the point of having an agreement which they've presented to both the parties. It is a compromise agreement. Both sides have to give up something. But it is an agreement that the mediators and broadly the international community think could be an important step forward for South Sudan. And now, with the involvement of these 5 other players, including the US and China and the African Union in a more kind of formal format, these other players should be able to add that gravitas and also the specter of leverage and consequences if the parties don't sign the agreement and commit to it before the deadline on August 17th. So the idea here is that IGAD made the agreement. They did it based on consultations with the South Sudanese, whether they're civil society or the warring parties. Now the agreement's on the table. The 2 warring sides need to sign it, and if they don't, then this plus element will kick in, and the plus will really create some kind of a plan B that makes it clear that if you don't sign the agreement, there will be consequences, justice, and accountability.
Mm-hmm. Sky?
What to add? I think one thing that might be worthwhile pointing out at this point in the conversation is that the peace agreement draft, that as it stands now, also contains a description or an agreement on a hybrid court, which would hopefully provide some kind of accountability for some of the crimes that have been committed. But I think that this is a bit of a watershed moment for accountability as well. I think if the two parties don't sign this agreement, then, you know, others will be looking more seriously to what other ways we could get accountability or some kind of investigation into some of the abuses that have taken place, including perhaps a referral to the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess I feel that recently I've been hearing more cautious optimism for a peace deal than I have in a while, and I think that that's due to a mix of different factors. It's because, you know, the opposition isn't doing very well militarily, and the government's been under a lot of pressure, and there is a kind of sense that this is a bit of a turning point moment, this August 17 deadline, but I hope that it's one for accountability as well.
And what do you think, what kind of role can China and the US play? Because they both are kind of battling for the African, you know, continent in a way, and we saw that with Obama's visit to Ethiopia, and they both kind of, you know, fighting in a way for their interests. So what kind of pressure can they put on the different on the two leaders, for example?
Well, I think.
Well, I mean, both China and the US have played a really important role already. The US also, perhaps especially, has taken quite an important leadership role, both in terms of you know, pressing for accountability, condemning the abuses, and you know, the UN Security Council in much earlier this year, you know, set out a sanctions regime for South Sudan, and since then 6 commanders have been put under UN Security Council sanctions, travel bans and asset freezes. So, you know, these are very important steps, and you know, we also now think that, you know, more people should be put under sanctions, including most recently for the government offensive in Unity State, which was highly abusive. And we, as an organization, we and others also have been very disappointed that the UN Security Council has not put an arms embargo on the government and the opposition and other groups fighting with them. We think that this has been a big missed opportunity. Some members of the Security Council were keen on an arms embargo very early on in this conflict, with Russia, China, and the US being less keen. So yeah, I mean, this is something that we think is quite an obvious step that needs to be taken. I mean, we've seen even in the last 6 months new weapons, new kinds of weapons being brought into this conflict. And we're very concerned that they and others will be used as weapons have been since the beginning of this conflict against civilians. So an arms embargo is good. I think also, you know, just getting some kind of clarity on, you know, what kind of justice and accountability mechanism. It's been incredibly confusing 19 months on that front. We had an African Union Commission of Inquiry report that was meant to set out the future for accountability, make a recommendation. That report has never appeared. And instead of making their own suggestions and moving forward, the US, China, the UK, the EU, the region itself, the whole issue has basically just been put on the back burner, which isn't it's really terrible given the scale of the atrocities that have been committed in this conflict.
Yeah, we're just about to move to the question of sanctions, so perhaps we can go on to that and discuss that a little bit more with Akshaya, for example.
Yeah, so I'm very happy that you brought up the Security Council Resolution 2206, because we were wondering whether travel bans or asset freezes were actually making a big difference. We know that they've been implemented in small amounts, but it's been sort of an odd give and take with leaders in this conflict. There's been peace agreements in the past that have offered amnesty to some of these leaders, and now we have some sanctions that may or may not be working. So I wanted to get a sense of whether actually you believe that the UN ought to be doing more, or if there is more of a role for them to play here in terms of sanctions, and targeted naming and shaming?
Definitely. We think that the sanctions which were implemented a couple of weeks ago are an important first step. But in fact, they are the first real multilateral evidence that the international community won't tolerate these kinds of gross human rights abuses that all of these commanders, the 6 who have been mentioned, were implicated in. We don't think that's enough. I want to underscore Sky's point about the arms embargo. We think that an arms embargo is really critical, but that the crux of this is going to be identifying targets for sanctions so that the sanctions regime is more than naming and shaming. Really looking at people who have assets stashed abroad so that the moment that the UN Security Council actually identifies an individual, at that same moment or on that same day, whether an individual has a bank account in Kenya or a mansion in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., those assets are frozen and seized. We think that asset freezes actually do have the potential to stop the flow of weapons, particularly if they target not just commanders, but also their enablers and the middlemen who are doing business for them. And so at this point, those are the people the Security Council's panel of experts should be looking into. And those are the people that we hope will be considered in the next round of designation.
Because the Enough Project has a new project, right? The Sentry?
That's right, yeah. So with the Sentry, we hope to do a little bit of that research ourselves and also to look into the dynamics of stolen wealth from South Sudan. South Sudan, when it came into being as a country, had billions in oil revenues. Unfortunately, when you go to Juba today, or if you go even to Bentiu, which is the capital of South Sudan's richest, most oil-producing state, you see very little evidence of those billions of dollars having been reinvested in the country. And I'm not just talking about roads or streetlights, I'm even talking about businesses or infrastructure. The vast majority of the South Sudanese elites who had access to wealth sought quickly to offshore that wealth in other places. And so it's our sense in our analysis that tracing those assets and proving that they were stolen from the country is key to ending this war, because those assets are, at the end of the day, in large part what these elites are fighting over, and they're also in some ways what they're using to fund their wars and their campaigns.
Thank you. Sky, do you want to add to that?
Nope.
Okay, great. So I have one more question on my end, and I'll hand it over to Marie. And this one is about President Obama's recent trip to Ethiopia and Kenya that was mentioned earlier. So in both his address to in the press conference and at his address at the African Union, President Obama affirmed that if no peace agreement materializes by the August 17th deadline, that the U.S. and its partners will have to, and I quote, consider other tools. Now, what other tools can we expect Obama to implement to raise the cost of intransigence? We saw that targeted targeted sanctions or the implementation of an arms embargo would probably have an effect. But do we think that Obama is likely to implement these come August 18th?
I don't know. I think Akshaya might have a more up-to-date insight into that. I mean, I hope so. I hope that that's what he means. I don't see South Sudanese constantly asking me, when is the U.S. going to come in with, a military intervention? I don't see that happening. I don't see even the number of peacekeepers being increased. I mean, there has been some discussion over, bigger kind of embargoes, like, more looking into more control of the oil money and all the rest of it. But yeah, I mean, I imagine that he's talking about more sanctions on more senior level people and potentially an arms embargo. And I mean, both of those, I think, could be quite useful.
Yeah. I agree with Sky. I think it's our sincere hope that that is what President Obama was talking about. I mean, I would say that it's our more sincere hope that we do see an agreement happen between now and August 17th. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of worrying rhetoric from both President Kiir's side and from the opposition side it seems to indicate that they're not yet ready to make the compromises necessary to sign that document. But if it's possible, that document, which would establish a transitional government, it would also create a hybrid court, as Sky mentioned earlier, and lay the groundwork for South Sudan to really have an opportunity to restart with a fresh start, and even include some provisions that would have greater supervision over the oil revenues, greater financial accountability measures, and the rest. And so I would say that everybody's first hope is that this agreement is signed, that both sides put down their weapons, and that this fighting ends and some justice and accountability be brought forward. But in the absence of that, yes, we do understand and expect that there will be additional designations against individuals who are more instrumental in the decision-making process for the conflict, as well as a consideration of an arms embargo. And we also hope these asset tracing measures against all the money that's been stolen from South Sudan for so many years.
Thank you. My last question would be, you know, when at the time when I guess we were all watching South Sudan when the country acquired independence, and we saw a lot of images of hope for the future of the country. In the future, what can we expect? We obviously all really like civil society groups and civilians who now bear the brunt of the conflict to be a lot more involved, to be given a voice, and to you know, take part in kind of nation building. Do you see that coming soon, perhaps? How can civil society try to make itself heard? You know, take part in the decision-making process.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to answer part of your question, and maybe Akshay will have more to add, but I mean, just to highlight a couple of things. One is that many, many decades of conflict, and not just conflict, but, you know, abusive conflict, has left, you know, South Sudan civil society is still just growing. It's
Oh, it's a connection with with Kenya. Perhaps Akshay, you can just quickly take it over.
Jump in, and then when Sky comes back.
Sure. What I would say to that is that we think that is incredibly important. I think that for any transition for South Sudan to really
over the last 5 years, but especially since this conflict began, we've seen a shrinking of the freedom of expression and space for civil society to operate. It's now harder than it's ever been before to, you know, talk about, you know, the government abuses. You know, I've talked to many friends, many people who privately will say, you know, both Salva and Riek Machar need to go. We need a new country. We need a new leadership. But no one feels safe saying that publicly. So, you know, it's an increasingly difficult environment for journalists and civil society to be able to pursue their own visions for the future.
Yeah. Chaya, perhaps you can take over again.
I would say that I agree with everything that Sky said. It's an incredibly challenging environment. There's been a lot of repression of independent voices, whether they're political voices or civil society voices, and attempts by the mediators and others to give civil society a place at the table in negotiating this agreement were really sidelined by the real hard lines of the government and the armed opposition. We hope that if this transitional agreement is signed and a new government comes into place, that there will be more support to civil society groups in South Sudan so that they can continue to lead the vanguard and push their government to be better, push the transitional government to really adhere to the provisions in the agreement, which are quite strong, and if implemented, could help South Sudan forge a new future. But that will require not just support in the form of capacity building and the rest, but also support in the form of solidarity from the U.S. government and others who have influence over these leaders to make it clear that if civil society continue to face the challenges that they're facing right now, then it won't be considered that the agreement is really being implemented.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Well, we really want to thank you both for taking part in this today, and I hope we'll be able to talk more in the future and collaborate again.
Definitely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.